I was 15 the first time someone laughed at my dream, and it wasn't just a snort or an awkward chuckle. It was full-blown, uncontrollable laughter that shook the kitchen walls. My brother Michael banged the table with his palm, nearly knocking over a pitcher of sweet tea. My mother wiped her hands on her apron and shook her head like she'd heard the most ridiculous thing a child could say. My Aunt Trish didn't even try to hide it. She cackled like I'd just tripped over my own future. I stood there in the middle of the kitchen, clutching my sketch pad like a lifeline, my hands sweating so hard the corners curled. I had drawn a portrait of my late grandmother, soft charcoal lines for her hair, smudged shadows under her cheekbones, her eyes like little windows to everything she'd never said out loud. I thought it was beautiful. I thought they would see what I saw. Instead, Michael asked if I traced it, and my mother said, "That's cute, honey, but let's focus on something real, okay?" Like nursing. That moment never left me, not even after a decade, not even after they stopped calling, not even now. Back then, I didn't have a room of my own. I shared it with my younger cousin Jada, who was always too loud and never asleep when I needed silence. I'd sit by the window on school nights, a broken flashlight tucked under my chin, drawing until the batteries dimmed to a flicker. Paper scraps, eraser dust, old pencil shavings, they were my world. Not a single person in that house thought anything would come of it. Not one. Art, they said, was a hobby. Something rich people pretended to do between tennis lessons and wine tastings. We weren't those people. We lived in a 2-bedroom rental on the east side of Mobile, Alabama, where the sidewalks cracked like old skin and the grocery store locked up baby formula behind glass. Dreaming was a luxury. And yet I dreamed like it was oxygen. I couldn't stop. At school, things weren't better. My art teacher, Mr. Randall, was the first adult who actually looked at my work like it mattered. He once told me my line work made silence feel loud. I didn't even know what that meant back then, but I never forgot it. Still, I couldn't bring my drawings home. Every time I did, they disappeared, either tossed in the trash accidentally, or used to light the barbecue pit out back. My mom said it was wasteful to use all that paper on something you can't sell. She never said it mean, not with sharp teeth, but with something worse. Indifference. That cold, empty space where belief should be. When I turned 17, I applied to the state college's art program without telling anyone. I forged my mom's signature on the financial aid forms. I sold old textbooks from school and cleaned houses after class to save up the application fee. I didn't tell a soul. The night the acceptance letter came, I opened it alone in the laundry room. The lights buzzed overhead and smelled faintly of bleach. I read it 5 times, then folded it into the back pocket of my jeans and walked back inside like nothing happened. That night, they joked around the dinner table about me going to beauty school like my aunt had. I smiled and passed the corn. The day I left home was a Tuesday. No balloons. No hacks. Just a half-hearted reminder for my mom to stay out of trouble and a shrug from Michael, who was too busy scrolling through his phone to look up. I packed everything I owned in 2 black trash bags. When the Greyhound pulled away from the curb, I didn't cry. I didn't wave. I sat still, my forehead pressed against the window, and imagined the smudges on the glass were brushstrokes I hadn't made yet. For the first time, the silence around me didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a blank canvas. College wasn't the salvation I expected. I had to work 2 jobs to afford rent in a shared apartment with 3 other students, all of whom had parents who mailed them grocery money and checked in weekly. I was invisible in class. My professors didn't recognize talent the way Mr. Randall had. They wanted theory, history, citations. They cared more about what dead painters thought than what I could do with a pencil and a silent room. Still, I kept drawing. On the backs of receipts, napkins, cafe menus, anything I could find. And late at night, when my roommates were asleep, I'd sit on the bathroom floor with my knees tucked under me and paint with watercolors I mixed from makeup and food dye. One night, while scrolling through the free Wi-Fi at the campus library, I found a posting for a local art contest. The prize was $1,000 and a gallery spot at a small but well-known studio downtown. It felt absurd to even consider it. I didn't even have real materials. but something about it gripped me like a voice whispering just behind my ear. I submitted a portrait of a woman I had imagined in my head. Her eyes were like mine, but older. Her hands rested in her lap, like she had just buried something too sacred to name. I painted her with borrowed paints and old cardboard. And then I let it go. 3 weeks passed. I forgot about it. Then an email arrived. I won. I stared at that message for 5 whole minutes before reading it again. Then again. And when the realization hit, I started shaking so badly, I dropped my phone in the sink. That single win changed everything. The gallery not only hung my piece, they sold it, before the night was over, to a collector. For $600. I cried on the floor of my shared apartment that night, not because of the money, but because someone saw me. A stranger. They looked at my art and didn't laugh. They paid for it. After that, I began painting with purpose. I saved every dollar, entered every show, created pieces that told stories no one else had told, about mothers who forget names, daughters who disappear in their own homes, girls with calloused hands holding invisible burdens. My work was raw, but it was real. And slowly, people started to notice. The more I painted, the more the world shifted. A local critic wrote a piece calling me a visual poet of forgotten women. A woman who had lost her daughter in a fire bought 3 of my prints. A gallery in New Orleans requested a full solo show. I wasn't rich, not yet, but I wasn't invisible either. That changed something in me. But what I didn't know then was that it would also change something in them, my family. It started small. A Facebook friend request from my cousin Jada, who used to complain that I made too much noise at night with my sketchbooks. Then came a like on my gallery photo from Aunt Trish. A comment from Michael. Proud of you, sis. I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because I didn't know what to say. Where were they when I was crying in a bathroom with blue food dye on my fingers? Where were they when I needed $50 for supplies, or just a quiet space to work? Silence is loud, but absence is louder. And then came the message from my mother. Just a simple line. Call me when you can. I saw your painting on the news. I didn't call. I closed the message and stared at it until the screen went black. Something about it felt like a door creaking open, but I wasn't ready to walk through. Not yet. Months passed. My solo show opened in New Orleans, and every piece sold. One collector, a woman with diamond earrings and an accent that stretched every syllable like silk, asked if I would do a custom piece for her home. I said yes. She offered $12,000. I didn't blink. I said my rate was $15,000. She smiled. Agreed. The day I received the wire transfer, I sat on the edge of my bed and let the quiet settle. Not the kind that crushes, the kind that soothes. I was no longer painting in corners. I was no longer hoping to be seen. I was being sought. And still, I hadn't gone home. Not until the day my mother showed up, unannounced, standing in the lobby of the gallery in a Sunday dress she hadn't worn in years. She looked smaller, older. Her eyes searched the walls as if trying to recognize pieces of the daughter she forgot to believe in. I watched her from a distance, behind the gallery glass. My heart thudded once hard. She turned her head slowly toward the biggest canvas in the room. A woman in silhouette, holding a frame with no photo in it. The title read, Unclaimed. She stared at it for a long time. Then she took a step back. Another. And she left. Didn't say a word. Didn't look back. But she saw it. She saw me. And that was enough, for now. The week after my mother visited the gallery, something shifted in the way I walked into rooms. I felt taller, somehow, like the silence that had always followed me no longer clung so tight. I didn't tell anyone she had come. Not my gallery director, not the collectors I had a call with later that day. It felt like a ghost brushing past, not scary, just cold. I thought that would be the end of it. But then a letter arrived. It came on a Thursday, slipped through the brass mail slot at my apartment. No return address, just my name written in handwriting I hadn't seen since high school. I opened it carefully, expecting something generic, but the first line stopped me. I didn't know how to be proud of you when I was always afraid of everything. It was from my mother. 3 pages, handwritten. No excuses, no forced apologies, just memories. She wrote about how she once wanted to be a seamstress, how she used to sketch dress patterns on church bulletins during Sunday sermons. But she never told anyone because her own mother said that kind of work wasn't for women with bills. She said watching me draw scared her, not because I wasn't talented, but because she feared I'd break in the same places she had. She wrote that when I left, she told people I was stubborn, selfish, unrealistic, but only because if she called me brave, it would make her cowardice harder to live with. I sat with that letter for hours. Read it twice. Then again slower. I didn't cry. I didn't know how to feel. This wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure. It was something else. A fracture that no longer throbbed, but hadn't quite healed either.
I didn't write back.
The next twist came 2 weeks later, during the opening of a new show called Inheritance. It was a series I'd worked on in silence for 6 months, paintings of women holding things they weren't meant to carry, invisible burdens, heavy silence, expectations. I'd poured every scraped-up piece of my memory into that series. The gallery was packed that night. People stood shoulder to shoulder, murmuring praise. A reporter from a national arts magazine hovered near the punch table, scribbling notes on a yellow pad. I wore a black silk blouse and a gold chain I had bought with my first major sale. I smiled. I answered questions. I felt seen. Then I saw her. Jada. She stood at the back of the room, holding a clutch bag like it had more in it than her dignity. She looked out of place, overdressed but underbelonging. When our eyes met, she didn't smile, just nodded. And suddenly, I was 14 again, hiding my sketches under the mattress while she sang too loudly along to songs on the radio. She walked toward me slowly, heels clicking like a clock. I braced myself, but she didn't ask for anything. She only said, "You were always the quiet one." I should have known it was because you were listening. Then she left. The next morning, my email inbox held a surprise I wasn't expecting. A private collector from New York, no name, just initials, was interested in buying the entire Inheritance series. Every piece. All 24. The offer was mid-6 figures. I sat very still, read the email twice, and let it sink in. My hands didn't tremble. My heart didn't race. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. This wasn't luck. This wasn't charity. This was work.
Meaning.
When the sale went public a week later, everything changed. My name was in magazines. A journalist called me. The voice of generational pain turned to power. I was flown out to do an artist's talk in Brooklyn. They put me up in a hotel with white robes and slippers I could take home. I did. I smiled at every question, signed every program. But deep inside, a new question was beginning to grow. What do you do when you get everything you once begged for? I returned home 3 weeks later to a voicemail from my brother, Michael. It was short.
Hey, it's Mike.
Mom's not doing great. Thought you should know. That was it.
No palagi. No worries.
Just another crack in the story. I didn't return the call. Not right away. Instead, I returned to my studio. A converted loft in a quiet part of the city, with light that spilled across the floor in the mornings like spilled milk. I tried to paint. Nothing came. The canvas felt too clean, too white, too untouched by the things I now carried. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. For the first time in years, I didn't know what to say through the brush. That night, I lay in bed and listened to the fan creak overhead. The silence felt different now. Less peaceful, more pointed. I didn't sleep. The next day, I booked a train back home. Mobile hadn't changed. The streets still cracked the same way. The grocery store still kept baby formula behind glass. But something about it felt smaller than I remembered. Like I had outgrown its shadow. When I walked into the house I hadn't seen in 6 years, my mother was sitting in her old recliner. Her hair had gone fully gray, and her hands trembled slightly when she set down the remote. She didn't rise. Just looked at me with tired eyes that still held questions. We didn't talk much. just sat in the living room while a rerun of a cooking show mumbled in the background. She asked if I wanted tea. I said yes. When she brought it out, she used the same chipped floral cup from my childhood. It made me feel eight again, and ancient all at once. That night, I slept in my old room. It smelled like dust and lavender. My sketches were gone, of course. But the grooves in the windowsill, where I used to rest my sketchpad, were still there. I ran my fingers over them like braille. Memory lives in wood. In the morning, my mother handed me a small cardboard box. Inside were papers I hadn't seen in years, old report cards, a church program from the day I sang in the children's choir, and at the very bottom, one of my early drawings. The portrait of my grandmother. Smudged, creased, but still intact. She had kept it. She said she didn't know why. Just that she couldn't bring herself to throw it out. For the first time, I believed her. I stayed 3 days. Long enough to mend what could be mended, short enough not to tear open new wounds. Before I left, she asked if she could see one of my new paintings in person. I promised I'd send her one. And I did. Not one of the famous pieces. Not the ones from New York or New Orleans. A new one. One I made the day I got home, of her. Quiet, soft. Not glamorous. Just her, as she was. I didn't sign it. I didn't have to. A month later, I got a call from a gallery in London. They wanted to represent me internationally. I said yes. Then the real twist came. One of my collectors, a serious buyer who had invested in my earliest work, reached out with a strange request. He had recently met someone claiming to be related to me, Michael. He said my brother had shown him childhood photos and stories, trying to add context to my work. He wanted to sell him a piece from my collection. The collector thought I should know. I didn't get angry. I laughed. It was the same laugh they gave me in that kitchen 10 years ago, but now it was mine. Loud, sure, unstoppable. They laughed when I said I'd be an artist. Now, they couldn't afford my work. The first time someone tried to forge my signature, I didn't believe it. Not because I thought it couldn't happen, but because I didn't want to believe that someone from my own family would go that far. But denial is fragile when facts are printed in ink. It started with a gallery email forwarded to my assistant by mistake. A small exhibit in Miami had received an inquiry about a limited series I had supposedly painted in my early years. The attached images were crude imitations, thin brushwork, no emotional core, poor anatomy. And yet the signature matched mine. Almost perfectly. Almost. The email trail led back to someone calling himself a representative for the artist's family, offering to sell these rare originals for 5 figures each. The name at the bottom of the email, Michael Andre. My brother. I remember sitting in my studio, the light from the high windows falling across my sketch table, the air thick with turpentine and disbelief. My hands didn't shake, but something colder settled into my chest, a deep, low anger that didn't flare but settled like weight. He wasn't just selling fakes. He was trying to rewrite my history. A silent sibling suddenly turned curator of my suffering. And the world was starting to believe him. But he wasn't smart.
Greedy, yes.
But not smart. He'd used a shared Gmail account, one he created years ago for our mother to check her church bulletins online. He'd send the emails without wiping the metadata. One look at the IP addresses and login location told the gallery all they needed to know. The gallery owner called me personally, horrified. I told them I'd handle it. Politely, calmly, as if my entire life's truth hadn't just been dragged through mud by the same people who used to call my art scribbles. I didn't call Michael. I called my lawyer. Within days, a cease and desist letter was drafted. A private investigator was hired to confirm the origin of the fake paintings, half of which were traced over Instagram-filtered versions of my real work. The evidence was clear. The fraud was clumsy. But the betrayal? That landed like a blade between my ribs. Meanwhile, the art world buzzed. Whispers of scandal. Conversations about the value of real versus fake. For the first time, I wasn't just the girl who survived her family's ridicule. I was a commodity, surrounded by controversy. And the truth? The controversy only made demand higher. Prices soared. Collectors doubled down. One magazine dubbed me the artist whose pain paints profit. I hated it, but I understood it. People loved a story with blood in the margins. A month later, I was invited to speak at a creative conference in Barcelona. I nearly said no, but the idea of distance, of air between me and that old hometown rot, felt like medicine. On the plane, I stared at the clouds, wondering if my brother even understood the damage he had tried to cause. Or worse, if he thought he had the right to cause it. Barcelona was sunlight on stone and perfume in the air. I walked through old alleys and sketched local faces. I ate olives that tasted like history. And on the final day, as I stood on stage in front of a crowd of young artists, I told them the truth. I told them about the laughter, the kitchen, the broken flashlight, and eraser dust. I didn't name names, but I didn't need to. The truth has a way of drawing its own lines. After my talk, a girl with tears in her eyes handed me a folded paper bird. On the wing, she'd written, "They laughed at me too. Thank you for surviving loud enough for both of us." I kept that bird. I still have it.
But the peace wouldn't last.
2 days after returning home, a letter arrived from a lawyer I didn't recognize. My mother had fallen ill, hospitalized. Complications from high blood pressure and years of untreated diabetes. The letter wasn't from the hospital. It was from her newly appointed guardian, none other than Clara Morrison. A woman I vaguely remembered from church potlucks. A woman with a smile like spoiled sugar. She had filed papers saying my mother was unable to make financial decisions, and as such, Clara would now be managing the estate. My name wasn't listed anywhere. Not as an emergency contact. Not as a power of attorney. Nothing. I called the hospital. They confirmed she was there, recovering but stable. When I asked why I hadn't been notified, the nurse paused. "Your brother said you were out of the country and couldn't be reached," she said. "He also said you weren't emotionally close." I hung up without another word. The next day, I got in my car and drove straight to Mobile. Not to reclaim lost love. Not to play nurse, but to look them in the eyes and remind them who I had become. At the hospital, I found Clara sitting in the lobby, holding my mother's handbag like it belonged to her. She smiled when she saw me. I didn't return it. She said, "You look tired. Long flight." I said, "You look guilty. Long con." She blinked, adjusted her scarf, and said nothing. I pushed past her and walked into the hospital room. My mother lay pale but awake. When she saw me, she didn't smile. But she didn't turn away either. For us, that was something. She whispered, "I didn't know they filed the papers." I didn't believe her. But I didn't fight her. Later, I sat in the hospital cafeteria, flipping through the guardianship documents Clara had filed. Pages of nonsense, terms meant to confuse, technicalities meant to exclude. But they had made one mistake. They forgot I had resources now. A legal team. Influence.
Voice.
By the following week, we filed to contest the guardianship. Turns out, Clara's financial history included questionable withdrawals from elderly clients. She hadn't counted on anyone noticing, but I had. It took 3 months, but we won. My mother's guardianship was revoked. A neutral party assigned. Clara was fined. Quietly. Legally. Enough to ruin her Sunday brunches for good. Michael? He went silent. Deleted his socials. Moved out of state, or so I heard. The fakes stopped circulating. And my paintings? They grew sharper. I painted a piece called Inheritance too. A woman with a mirror for a face, surrounded by open hands, some begging, some stealing, none offering. It was purchased by a museum in Tokyo. And through all of it, I never returned to the house I grew up in. I didn't need to. I had already left once, and this time, I took everything worth carrying with me. Sometimes I paint in silence. Sometimes I blast old gospel music while scraping oil across canvas. But always, I remember who I was when no one else did. I remember the laughter.
And I paint louder.
The gallery in Berlin had high ceilings, concrete floors, and white walls so clean they looked like they'd never touched time. It was my first European solo show, and it sold out before opening night. Collectors were calling it haunting. Critics said my brushwork reminded them of trauma frozen in amber. I stood in front of the final piece, one that showed a faceless girl holding a bouquet of family photos burning at the edges, and thought, for the first time, maybe they finally saw what I'd been saying all along. That memory isn't just a story we tell. It's a thing that bites if you feed it too long. My mother had been moved to an assisted living facility after the court ruling. I paid for a private room. Not out of obligation. Out of finality. There's a strange kind of peace in knowing you've outlived their version of your limits. The caretakers said she didn't talk much anymore. Spent most of her time watching the garden or folding paper napkins without thinking. The irony didn't escape me. I hadn't spoken to Michael since the legal battle ended. He disappeared. But disappearing is hard in the age of digital footprints, and even harder when you're careless. One night, after a long day of interviews and gallery tours, I got a call from a friend in the art community. "Did you know your brother's trying to start an art consulting agency?" she asked, her voice sharp. "He's using your name, telling people he helped launch your early work." I laughed. I actually laughed. Not a quiet, bitter one. A loud, disbelieving sound that echoed in my apartment like a warning siren. I found the website. Sloppy. Pretentious. Landry and Company. Creative Strategy. A page dedicated to his philosophy on artistic evolution. A stock photo of someone who wasn't even him shaking hands with a faceless client. And buried halfway down the site, a quote. "I helped guide my sister, a now globally recognized painter, from charcoal sketches to international acclaim. Let me do the same for your creative journey." I stared at the screen, jaw locked. The next morning, I sent the screenshots to my legal team. But it didn't stop there. 2 weeks later, I received a package. No sender listed. Inside was a thick folder labeled Proposal. I flipped through it slowly. Page after page of a business plan, an unauthorized documentary. Blood in the frame, the true story behind the painter's rise. A handwritten note inside read, "We think your story is too powerful not to tell. Let's partner." The family perspective adds edge. The signature? Michael Landry. I didn't feel rage this time. I felt something colder. The understanding that some people don't grow. They just learn to mimic growth until they're close enough to touch what they never built. I didn't reply, but I didn't ignore it either. I reached out to a documentary team I trusted. An independent group that specialized in quiet resistance, in stories that exposed but also healed. I told them everything.
Not just the family parts.
The silence. The sketchpad under the mattress. The kitchen laughter. The forged documents. The girl who folded napkins like shields. They agreed. Filming began 6 months later. I flew back to mobile under the radar. No announcement. No press. Just me and a camera crew in a black van parked 2 streets away from a house I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. We filmed from a distance at first. Voiceovers. Shots of the cracked pavement. The grocery store with the glass case. The porch where I once sat, dreaming with a flashlight low on battery. But then something happened we didn't plan for. A neighbor approached the van. It was Mr. Alvin, the old veteran who used to sit on his porch across the street and yell at kids to keep off his grass. He was older now, slower, but his eyes were clear. "You filming something?" he asked. One of the crew explained it was a documentary about local art. He squinted at me, then pointed with a shaking hand. "You're the quiet girl. The one with the big eyes. You used to draw my cat." I nodded. That was me. He smiled, slow and toothless. "You made it out." That night, I cried for the first time in years. Not out of pain, but because someone from the place I thought forgot me, had remembered the right version of me. Not the one my family tried to paint over. The documentary expanded. We interviewed Mr. Randall, my high school art teacher. He still had one of my early drawings pinned behind a glass case in his classroom. "I told them," he said to the camera. "I told them this girl's hands could speak." I watched the footage on a monitor. wrapped in a shawl and surrounded by strangers who somehow understood me better than my own blood ever did. And just as we were preparing to wrap, the final twist came. One of the producers received a cease and desist letter from Michael's lawyer. It claimed defamation, violation of family privacy, unauthorized use of name and likeness. The usual noise. We didn't flinch. Everything in the documentary was verifiable. Every claim backed by documents, recordings, court transcripts. And then another letter from my mother. Not handwritten.
Typed. Neatly.
Coldly. I do not give permission to use my name, image, or medical information in any public broadcast. I wish to remain uninvolved. Any association between myself and the subject is not endorsed. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. I had long stopped expecting anything from her, but it confirmed what I already knew. Some people aren't just silent. They prefer shadows. Still, we moved forward. The documentary was retitled Canvas, What They Tried to Cover. It premiered at a small film festival in Austin. Then it exploded. Streaming services reached out. News articles ran stories about it. Emails poured in from survivors of similar families, artists whose dreams were mocked, daughters whose mothers called them fragile for wanting more. And one morning, 6 months later, I received a check. Royalty from the film's distribution deal. 7 figures. I sat alone in my studio, the check in one hand, a brush in the other. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post about it. I just painted. This time, I painted a woman sitting in front of a blank canvas. No face. No hands. Just a shadow of someone about to begin. And I titled it, Chapter 1. Because even now, after all they tried to steal, my voice, my name, my truth, I was still just getting started. The morning the documentary won its first award, I was alone in my cottage, near the coast. I hadn't gone to the ceremony in LA. I hadn't even watched the live stream. I found out when my phone buzzed with a message from the director. We won. Audience choice. You did this. I stared at the screen, then out the window, where the sea moved quietly under the morning light. For a second, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt empty, like a balloon that had flown so high, it popped in air too thin to breathe. Victory is strange when no one you once wanted to impress is there to witness it. But then again, maybe that was the point. I had finally learned how to win for myself. Still, the success came with more than just praise. Journalists began digging into my past, trying to find names, statements, loose ends. One even showed up at my old neighborhood, interviewing neighbors who barely remembered my name. Another contacted a cousin I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. And then one reached my mother. An article ran the next week titled, A Estranged Matriarch Speaks. I just didn't understand her vision. My mother was quoted saying she always knew I was different, that I was driven and artistic, but that she feared I would get hurt chasing unrealistic things. The journalist called it a mother's regret. But I knew better. She hadn't spoken to me in nearly a year. The interview wasn't regret, it was reinvention. The last attempt to rewrite her role in my story before the world closed the book. And still, I said nothing publicly.
No statements. No rebuttals.
I had learned that silence, when chosen, is power. Instead, I painted a new series. This time in red, gold, and ash gray. I called it The Ones Who Stayed Quiet. Each canvas showed a woman mid-motion, sweeping a floor, tucking a child into bed, staring through a fogged-up window. Their faces soft but alert, always listening, always knowing. It was a love letter to those who kept going even when no one clapped. The series opened in Paris. Every piece sold before the second day. I thought that was the final peak, the closing mountain of a long, jagged climb. But then, one last message arrived that shifted everything again. It was from a woman named Cynthia Mercer, a lawyer. She represented an estate, a collector who had passed away in New York, one who had bought one of my earliest works at a charity auction, years before anyone knew my name. In his will, he had left the painting to the Museum of Modern Art. But he'd left something else to me. A letter. Cynthia mailed it. I opened it in my studio, hands steady but breath shallow. The handwriting was precise, careful. The letter said he had seen something in that painting, the look of someone about to break, but choosing not to. He wrote that he'd followed my journey, quietly, like one does with a poem that keeps changing each time you read it. He ended with a line that rooted into me like a tree. We never know who's watching us survive. I folded the letter and placed it in a wooden box I kept under my bed. A box filled with other letters, some from collectors, some from students, one from a girl in Ukraine who had watched the documentary with subtitles and sent me a sketch of her grandmother as a thank you. That box had become heavier than any grudge I once carried. 1 week later, I received an invitation to speak at a youth arts conference in Atlanta. Not a flashy event, no celebrities or press. Just rows of folding chairs, plastic name tags, and students with ink on their fingers and stars in their eyes. I said yes. When I arrived, the auditorium was half filled. Most of them didn't know my name, just that I was that artist from the documentary. I stepped on stage in a simple gray dress, no jewelry, no makeup. I brought nothing with me.
No slides. No portfolio. Just a story.
I told them everything. Not just the polished version. The truth. The flashlight. The napkins. The quiet betrayals. The rage that learned how to walk on stilts. The tears I turned into color. I told them about love, without language. About people who call you family while stealing your name. When I finished, no one clapped right away. Then slowly they stood. Not all at once. Not with the rush of excitement, but with the gravity of understanding. Like something had shifted in the room. Afterward, a girl about 16 approached me. She had a smear of paint on her cheek and carried a spiral notebook filled with sketches. She didn't say much, just held out a drawing. It was of a girl walking alone, her shadow longer than her body. But in the shadow, there were wings. I drew you, she said, and I cried. Quietly.
Deeply.
Right there in front of strangers who no longer felt like strangers at all. That night, I went back to my hotel and opened my journal. Not the one they once tried to steal, but a new one. The cover had my name embossed in gold. And for the first time, I wrote, "My name is Soline. I am the artist they never saw coming." The next year, I released a book. Part memoir, part sketchbook. It was called Still Life, Becoming Myself Out Loud. The cover was simple, white background, one black line drawing of a girl standing in front of a blank canvas. It sold well. But more than that, it traveled. Schools, shelters, even prisons ordered copies. I received letters from places I'd never visit, from voices that had been hiding too long. They said things like, "You made me brave," and "Now I know I'm not crazy for wanting more." But the real ending came quietly. One spring evening, I returned to Mobile.
No cameras. No announcements.
I wore jeans, a hoodie, and sunglasses. I walked through my old street, past the porch where my brother used to mock my ugly people drawings, past the cracked sidewalk that swallowed my first pair of sketching pencils when I dropped my backpack. And I stopped at a house I hadn't seen in over a decade. My mother's assisted living home. She was in the garden, folding a napkin into something shapeless. She didn't notice me at first. Then she looked up.
We didn't speak.
I sat beside her on the bench. The air smelled like hydrangeas and distant rain. After a long silence, she handed me the napkin. It was folded into a crooked swan. One wing collapsed. The head bent the wrong way. I took it gently. Didn't fix it. Because some things aren't meant to be perfect. They're meant to remind us we survived anyway. I stood, placed the napkin on her lap, and left.
No oublié.
No drama. Just a full stop at the end of a sentence I had written myself. Back at the cottage that night, I lit a candle. Pulled out a fresh canvas. This time I didn't paint pain. I painted peace. Not because the story ended, but because I had finally stopped needing to prove that I belonged. I do.